Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our third discussion forum for the manual implementation and the collection management and curation training course. We're very pleased that you could all join us this morning. I suspect that there may still be people who will join. We did have a lot of registrations, but I think we will get started. So this morning we've got one guest panelist or presenter, that's Maxi, who is from the NSCF, but she's based at the KZN Herbarium. So welcome, Maxine. And then we've got Fulu Tambani, who is running the whole discussion forum, the technical side. And then I'm Michelle Hamer, and I'll be doing most of the sort of facilitating the discussion forum this morning. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are just our standard guidelines for engagement in a virtual platform. So please keep your contributions helpful and considerate of the host and other participants. So there is a chat box that you can use. You can use it to say hello and let us know where you're from. And then you can also use the chat box to add questions about the presentations or during the discussions. So it's a discussion forum, and so there is opportunity for discussion, and please feel free to start a discussion and actively engage when we are having discussions. And you can either use the chat box, or there will be an opportunity for people to speak up from the group. All right, so next slide, please. Okay, so this morning, our discussion forum follows on from the webinar that we had 2 weeks ago. And it's again about risk assessment and the risk management process. And in the manual, this is actually only chapter 7, I think, but we've brought it forward in this program just because it's such a critical part of looking after our collections. And so we thought that it's really urgent that we deal with it. And people always try and avoid thinking about it because it's often so scary to think about your building going up in flames, having a massive pest outbreak, having water damage, finding specimens that have dried out or that are rotting in bottles. And then we also know that, staff who are very experienced and knowledgeable are getting old and leaving. And we prefer to just avoid thinking about all of these things, but they are reality. So a number of museums around the world have gone up in flames: Brazil, the Notre Dame in Paris, and the scary fires that were at UCT earlier this year. And other sort of less immediate disasters are there, they happen. And so we have to think about risk assessment. It's our responsibility. Next slide. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to hear about how risk identification was done for a collection. So Maxine will be telling us about how she did it for KZN Herbarium. And we'd hoped that we'd have more volunteers. Maxine was the only brave person amongst us who stepped forward to do a presentation. But then we'll open the floor to anyone to contribute and ask, have you done a risk assessment or identified risks for your collection? And how did you go about it? And what did you learn from doing that? And we'll see if we can, how much input we get. We can learn from each other. And then what we're going to do is to spend time on how to do the risk assessment using an example that I've got. And this is very closely linked to the assignment that was given at the webinar for the people doing the course, but of course it's useful for everybody in terms of implementing the manual. So we've got a hypothetical collection, we've identified the risks for it, and then you'll be working in groups to do the analysis and the evaluation of the risks. So this is, as usual with these discussion forums, it's an opportunity to learn from each other, to ask questions, and to really spend 2 hours today just thinking about risk assessment so that you can take it forward for your collection. Right, next slide. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Maxine to do her presentation on doing the risk assessments at KZN Herbarium. So over to you, Maxine.
Thank you, Michelle, and good morning to everybody. Today, I'm going to be taking you through how I performed my risk assessment for SANBI KwaZulu-Natal Herbarium. Next slide, please. So why do we need a risk assessment for herbaria collections, and why is this important? Well, let's take a look and see. Next slide, please. On the left-hand side, we have a diagram, and this was taken from the SANBI website. And basically what this diagram is telling us are the different roles and functions performed by SANBI. So the first 3 tiers are the different roles and the functions, and the overarching roof is how these roles, what it influences. Now, in this diagram, the very first tier, the very bottom level, you see I circled it. That's called Foundations of Biodiversity. And under that, the very first thing under that is collections. Now, this is really important. What does this tell us? What does collections being the foundation? What does that reveal to us? That shows us that collections affects the top tier, which are assessments, monitoring, modeling, trends, and status. Those assessments done on collections and taxonomy and all of that then affects the policy advice, the planning, the information, the models, and the tools. And that policy advice and all of that is taken to influence human well-being, improved service delivery, and job creation. So from this diagram, we can see how fundamentally important collections are and what role they play. So let's take a look now at SANBI KZN Herbarium. The herbarium houses approximately 140,000 plant specimens, and they have a separate wet collection. Now, this collection is a source of valuable information and serves as a baseline data for taxonomy, DNA analysis, locality data for field trips, GIS mapping and locality, and as well as priority plant revisions. The herbarium is also a heritage site. It was established in 1882 by the late John Medleywood with the help of others. And to date, we have approximately 6,000 of these specimens still in the herbarium. The collection also serves as material for teaching. Every year pre-COVID, we would get students 4 times a year from different institutes in KZN, and they would come for a week-long course on herbarium techniques course. And basically what this course introduced the students to was collecting plant specimens, mounting plant specimens, identifying taxonomy, and it also introduced students into systematic research, which in my opinion is of fundamental importance because it's not spoken about enough. So now that we know why the collections are fundamentally important and we have a brief overview of SANBI, let's see how I performed my assessment. Next slide, please. So the very first thing I did was I spoke to some colleagues at the herbarium. We have a colleague who has been at the herbarium for 38 years. That means he has a valuable insight and wisdom into the collections. He has grown with the collections. So speaking to this individual gave me much insight and widened my horizon and allowed me to see things from a different perspective. I then did a physical inspection where I walked throughout the herbarium inside and out, trying to identify, are there any factors that could be a potential risk to the collections? I then went through the health and safety files at the herbarium. So every year, KZN Herbarium does a health and safety assessment. So I wanted to see what did they deem as a risk and a hazard, and what were their findings in comparison to mine. And lastly, I went through the NSCF Collection Management Manual, as well as some literature. Now let's see what were the possible risks, or what were the risks to the herbarium. Next slide, please. So these are the 4 risks that came about when I was doing my assessment. The very first one is fire. Then we have physical forces, we have increase in temperature, and we have pest infestation. And I'm going to explain all of this in the next slide, please. So the very first risk is fire, and in brackets I have water damage. I will get to that in a minute or so. So I categorize this as a rare event, the chance of occurrence. And in the manual, it says a rare event happens less often, or about once every 100 years. And the reason fire came out as a risk is because we have products and we have appliances in the herbarium that could spark an electrical fire. We have printers, scanners, computers, laptops, and all of these things. Now, if a fire sparks, an electric fire sparks when no one is at the herbarium, it could quickly manifest and quickly turn into something huge, because we do not have gas cylinders, which gas cylinders that will put off the fire when smoke is detected. Also, the entire herbarium has wooden flooring, and most of the collections are in wooden cabinets. So if a fire had to start out, that fire is going to spread quite quickly throughout the herbarium. And this is going to result or impact the collection. Either part or the entire collection is going to be destroyed, including our valuable library and invaluable accession registers and journals. Now we have approximately 8 accession registers at the herbarium, and detailing most of the specimens that are found in the herbarium, as well as journals from the late John Medleywood, where he would detail his plant collecting trips. Now, unfortunately, none of these have been digitized as yet. So if a fire had to break out, there's a possibility of losing this valuable information. Now, the reason I put water damage in brackets is because, just say a fire started and we have a security guard, but let's say he's on the other side of the property and he doesn't notice the smoke until very much later. It's spread throughout one part of the herbarium. The fire brigade is down the road, so the fire brigade comes. They're going to use water hoses, and when they release that water, it's released with a large pressure. That pressure could potentially damage the specimens inside. Also, I said that most of our collection is in wooden cabinets. What happens to wood when it gets wet? It swells up. When wood swells, it's going to crush the specimens inside. With the entire wooden cabinets being wet, being immersed in water, it's going to weigh heavier. And there's a potential, because we have wooden flooring, there's a potential for those collections or cabinets to collapse because of the weight of this. So that the water damage is caused merely by a fire. Let's go to the next risk, physical forces. And I deem this as a cumulative effect, and this means it can occur continuously or intermittently. Now, the entire collection is found in one-story building, so it's in one building. But the problem with this is we have an ever-growing collection, but we do not have space for the collection. This will unfortunately mean that maybe sometime in the future, some specimens are going to have to be stored into shelves till the brim of the shelf, until more storage equipment is bought and more storage areas found for these specimens. Over time, what does that do to specimens? It unfortunately damages specimens. We also have, every year we have visitors, researchers, volunteers, students that come to the collection and use the collection. Now, before a person handles a collection, if they do not know how to handle specimens, we give them a crash course. But that does not mean that everybody is going to handle specimens with the utmost care. Sometimes a student or an intern, someone may handle specimens and the fruits will fall off, or the leaves will fall off, or the seeds will fall off. This damages the specimens over time and takes away from that specimen, because in order for research purposes, we need an entire specimen that has everything. So over time, this could lead to parts of the collection being damaged. Now, the next 2 risks I'm going to categorize together and talk about together. increase in temperature. Generally, herbaria have to be kept at a constant temperature. Now, sandy KZN herbarium gets extremely hot in summer and extremely cold in winter. Now, what happens? We do have air cons, but just say the air cons don't work in summer. What will happen? That will give an increase, that will give rise to an increase in temperature in the herbarium. With an increase in temperature in the herbarium, that is going to lead to an increase in pest infestation. So pest infestation is extremely bad, especially pests such as cigarette beetles, because cigarette beetles eat dry plant specimens. They thrive where there's dried plant specimens, and they also thrive in increased temperature. So this is going to damage part of the collection. So now we see what the 4 risks to the collections are and how I performed the assessment. Let's see what I have learned throughout this assessment. Next slide, please. So the very first thing I learned was risks need to be identified and categorized. Not all risks are risks. They may be a risk or they may be a hazard. Now, a hazard is a potential to cause harm, and the risk is the likelihood of that occurring plus the consequences of it. Now, in order to categorize whether it's a risk or whether it's a hazard, you have to look at different factors. The factors include the magnitude of it, the percentage of it occurring, the frequency of it, the impact of it. When you look at all of those factors, that will tell you whether it is a risk or whether it is a hazard. Also, capacity needs to be included in the assessment. Now, when I talk about capacity, I mean outside factors that will reduce the effect of that risk. I'm going to give you an example. When I was researching for my presentation, research or literature indicated that Durban is a high flooding zone or is prone to lots of flooding. And when I saw that, I immediately typed number 5, my risk is flooding. But then I had to ask myself, if over the past 38 years, there has been no flooding in the herbarium, but Durban is prone to flooding, what's happening? And then I had to look at outside factors that will reduce the risk of the flooding. KZN herbarium is built on a slope, and on that slope we have drainage areas and drainage points. Around the vicinity of the herbarium we have drainage areas. So even though Durban Berea may receive high rainfall amounts per year, it's not enough to infiltrate the doors or the herbarium and to flood the building, because we have drainage sites and drainage areas. So this capacity reduces the risk, reduces the impact of the risk. Also, risk assessments prevent minor risks from becoming major risks. And when I talk about risk assessment, I'm talking about physical curation of your collection. Now let's talk about a cigarette beetle. Let's just say a part of the collection, the entire collection is fully digitized. And so a part of the cabinet is not used for 2 years because no one is using or dealing with those families. And after 2 years, a visitor comes and needs to identify a certain family or use that cabinet. And when they take out specimens, they see cigarette beetles, and they see the black things that are left by cigarette beetles. When you go throughout your entire collection, you see that there's an infestation of cigarette beetles. Why did that happen? Because if you identified that risk in the beginning, if you saw a cigarette beetle, you could have done fumigations and all of those things to reduce that risk and to eliminate that risk. But because that risk because it was left for a prolonged period of time, it then manifested and became a major risk, which could result in most of that cabinet or those plant specimens being destroyed. And with that, I thank you for your time. And this is how I performed my risk assessment and what I learned during this risk assessment. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Maxine. So I think that was a very useful overview of what you can do just to identify your risks and to start thinking about them.